next presentation is by Zab Johnson. Now, she's come all the way from Wharton. Thank you, Zab, really appreciate that. She's Executive Director and Senior Fellow of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative at the Wharton School here at Penn. She's going to be talking to us on the topic of viewing alone or together, how social interaction impacts our experience.
Thank you. So much of my work has been done already. The seeds have been planted, but I'll try and reinforce some of those messages. So first of all, I want to thank, none of this would be possible without these deep collaborations that I've developed. Some of the people are in the room, including Bill Perthes and Vera Ludwig, and some are over international waters. Sasha Igdalova, who was a Penn undergraduate student, she was a graduate of 2011 in the Visual Studies program. There are Visual Studies faculty here now. And she is now currently a PhD student at Goldsmiths University in London with Becky Chamberlain. And so I sort of want to tell you a little bit of the evolution of how someone who's at Wharton came to start to think about this kind of project, because there's some sort of paths along the way, but I think it actually all sort of makes sense. I also want to point out that Louise Thompson and Fiona Corridon at the Manchester Art Gallery have been really critical for some of this work, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but they've been working mostly directly with Sasha and Becky. Marianne Wardle, who was on that slide, who is now the director of the College of Worcester Art Museum, she and I were at Duke University before I came to Penn, and we had the privilege and the honor to teach in Paris every summer, right? We taught an art, vision, and the brain class for 6 weeks in Paris. We spent the mornings in the classroom learning concepts, and then every afternoon in a different museum setting, okay? And we told our students that this was an experience of a lifetime and that they were going to have to embrace the methodology, that this was not going to be a tourism visit, and that later in their lives they would come back and realize what an extraordinary opportunity that was. And as part of that experience, one of the first things that we actually asked our students to do in the museum was to spend an hour with one artwork. Okay, so this was actually inspired by Jennifer Roberts' work at Harvard. She sends her students out for 3 hours to view a work, and has reinforced for a long time the aspects of slow looking as this revelatory experience, right? And I'm a visual neuroscientist, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how that came to be part of my mantra. But in vision, we often think of what we see as being instantaneous because our brains are so incredibly efficient and effective and quick, right? But when you actually spend a long time with an artwork or any visual stimulus actually at all, you realize that there are things that actually only emerge over time. And we're not reinforcing this practice for many students at all different levels. Right, I'm including students. I'm not talking about university and college students. I'm talking about everyone who is a human learner across the lifespan. To think about time in it as an asset rather than a liability. Okay, and for one, we definitely know that our young people think that information should come to them very, very fast. They've come to expect that, right? And they don't actually understand this process of this emergence of information that can come over time. And what we found, and of course what you can see is that some students get really tired, right? And we picked the Contemporary Museum of Art in Paris for this because it has relatively fewer visitors. And so sometimes I had pictures of students sprawled out on the floor, on these hard concrete floors, but they did the exercise. And by the end of that exercise, and they did this alone, they would come to us and say that they had never thought that they could do that, much like Bill already said about the digital immersive experience, but that they suddenly realized, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes in, that they were now seeing things in a whole new way. Okay? And so it was a really, really wonderful kind of experience. But on top of that, what we also started to realize is that as students were actually sharing their experiences with others, they wanted to also do this socially. Okay. And so there was a subsequent exercise that they would do where they would actually do this now in small teams of 2 or 3. And it was in those experiences where they started to realize that they did not see the world the same way as the person next to them. Okay? That someone else's lived experience, expectations, assumptions about their world could emerge through the process of conversation around something as neutral as art. Like nobody had to be invested in art, right? Nobody had to even like the artwork that they were looking at. Actually, they went through a gamut of emotions around it, but it like literally changed what they saw in a new way, okay? Because they were hearing things from someone else and suddenly the visual stimulus actually shifted and changed for them. Okay, so I think there's a unique positioning here for visual art around perspectives and around the idea of social engagement that hasn't had a lot of time being spent on this. Okay. And we know that there's emerging neuroscience that actually is starting to come across that things around these sort of social conversations, especially around inherently ambiguous stimuli. In this case, in this particular study, this is a study that was done by Bo Sievers when he worked with Uri Hassan and Talia Wheatley. Uri is at Princeton, Talia is at Dartmouth. And they had brought people into the lab. They watched movies while their brain activity was being recorded. And the movies were inherently ambiguous. You actually couldn't tell what was happening in the story on purpose. And then after that experience, then they sat around the table with others that had also had those viewing experiences and had to reach a consensus on what they thought was happening. So there was this emergent process, much like what we do with art, where they had to sort of come up with what they thought was the best outcome. And what they found was that people that sat around the table, and even more importantly, the makeup actually of the team mattered, and who facilitated the conversations and how exactly that person was in a social network in their own lives. That then predicted the brain activity of those viewers seeing novel clips in a subsequent phase of the experiment. Okay? It had neurally aligned people's minds. Okay? And they could tell apart different groups from the data. They could tell who had reached a consensus with one another, and they could also tell things around team dynamics that were emerging because there were some minds that never aligned. Okay, so I find that incredibly uplifting and interesting, and I think we have a lot of things to do, a lot of questions still around that. And so this then led me to this next phase, which is I bring learners, again, at all different levels, and I make use of the Barnes Foundation. So here you can actually, for those of you who haven't visited, you can see some of the unusualness of this institution, this educational institution. And I wedged my foot in the door, and Bill has been an incredible partner, very tolerant with this. And this includes students, undergraduates, all the way up through business executives, people that actually would not ever step foot in these kinds of environments. And they go through this sort of conversation around a particular artwork, and they spend an hour with it, just like my students did in Paris. And after those experiences, what they tell us is that they feel more able to take psychological risks with one another, that they're able to have conversations about other things that they never had expected, and that they began to be able to take in evidence from other people in a new and novel way. Okay? So that really, really fomented this passion for me to try to capture some of the data on that. I wanted to move beyond the experiential into capturing some of the data. And one of the most interesting things is that we know that people go into museums and into any art experience. And some people do that to be contemplative and to be alone and to have a meditative experience. And some people go there to be social or to find others that share their kinds of experiences. And so that was really the heart of this beginning question that I'll tell you a little bit about next. And so, and I think that this is a really critical part, like that has been overlooked, which is how these social engagements can actually change well-being outcomes, the ways that people take in information, and even subsequent decision-making and team dynamics, those kinds of things. Okay, and we already know from the Surgeon General, and Sunil mentioned, right, that we're in an epidemic of loneliness. Before the COVID pandemic, there was a Gallup poll that suggested that 25% of college students report that they don't even have one friend. Okay, it plummeted during COVID, right? And now the more recent data suggests that 25% of global adults don't feel socially connected with one another. Okay, so the arts are one of those places, again, of neutrality, which I think that we can start to be able to build bridges and get people to think about engaging socially with one another in a novel way. So I'll quickly summarize this. So we had two components to this. One was in an art gallery, was in the Manchester Art Gallery, in a specific room that had been designed by a well-being expert with a curator. That room is called Room to Breathe. It's got art placed in a very specific way to be lower to the ground and more viewable. There's more comfortable furniture. It's painted in more soothing colors. It's lit in a very specific way, and it's supposed to be a little bit more isolated for those who feel like others are distracting, or the general museum has adverse or sensory stimulation. And Sasha really ran with the museum context. And two artworks were chosen that were part of that collection. You can see them here. One was sort of a landscape, more representational, and one was very abstract. And we ran here in parallel an experiment in the lab. Why did we do that? Because many people are moving to digital platforms. We also know that experiences are actually really different when you're in a space than when you're not, or when you're actually looking at the physical objects and when you're not. And we thought that it would be sort of interesting to capture that also in real time, and also in a different kind of demographic and population. So in Manchester, it's a no-cost art gallery. It's in a working class city. So they often get people who just come by to spend an hour, and there's no fee to get in. And of course, at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Wharton School, we have not that. Okay. So, all right. And here's just the outline of our data collection. You can see that there are distinct differences. I'll let you just read this, demographic differences. But we had three different conditions. One where people were brought into either the museum setting or the lab where they were doing this by themselves, or in a group that was synchronized. 3 people at a time were looking at the same artwork while they were hearing a facilitated overview. And they were doing a 10-minute looking exercise, 10 minutes for each painting. But they weren't socially interacting. And in the discussion group, there were 3 people, and they were in that same context, but now they were actually asked to have conversations at different intervals as they were brought in, okay? And what you can see is in the lab, mostly it was a university sample, and you can see that they reported neutral to moderate interest in visual art, and there was a difference with that, with those that had volunteered to come into the museum, because they were already in the museum, okay? And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight that we found, this is just self-report, is that the discussion group reported actually much more social connectedness and closeness in both the lab and the museum, and that that this is connectedness on a scale that's like not just with the people that are with them in that moment. Of course, we wouldn't be able to capture that for the individuals, right? But how connected they feel actually to the world and to a community at large, right? And then we captured the other data here. I don't have a pointer, doesn't work, but that's okay. But you can see that connectedness to your group was very facilitated by these kinds of discussions in a way that seems intuitive. Like if you just sit there with others, it actually doesn't help you feel any closer to them. Okay, so you can see that amplified. All contexts actually decrease stress. And there were actually differences, but it was actually different. It was only different because I think our population of students was much more stressed to begin with. Okay. But they also started to say things like, wow, I've never done anything like this. This was really engaging and soothing. Not everybody, but there were people. And I think that that's really important, is that, again, these kinds of slow looking exercises can actually change your perceptions of your own physiology. Okay. Participants reported increases in positive emotions in the discussion group. And that happened for both the lab and the museum. Okay. And what you can see is that there is a difference here. For those who are unfamiliar with box plots, I'm just showing you all of the heterogeneity of the data. But what you can see is that in the museum, people also found the individual viewing as being more positively effective. Okay. People in the lab, not so much, right? But again, their motivations are different. Okay. And nobody had changed negative emotions. So that's a good sign also that like this is positive well-being effects. And of course, this is right after the viewing. We have longer term data. We just haven't yet analyzed it. Okay. And as Bill also already alluded to, we have some really nice emerging data that suggests that our participants in the museum felt the viewing exercise, when there was a discussion, went by much faster. Okay. And I think we're at just the beginning of this, because I think actually the longer you have people do a slow looking exercise, the faster the time goes. I think these 10 minutes is just actually almost too short to be able to see these kinds of effects. But in the lab, I think asking people to look at a screen with an artwork for an hour would be painful. And especially if they were sitting next to two people in a room with no windows and stark white walls, as we've already also heard about. Okay. And these are just the subjective reports across a big index that people really found the viewing experience positive. And this will be great for all the people that work in our institutions. This was especially the case in the museum. Okay, so, and again, the environment probably matters. So as my wrap up, what we want, of course, to do is to start to also include other, not just self-reports, which we know can be gamed or not as accurate, but actually put in neurometrics. I'm a neuroscientist, like I said. I think we can actually begin to measure these kinds of physiological changes in real time. And this is sort of a full circle, because this is a pilot that we did. This was March 10th, 2020. Okay, so we were all prepped to do this. And we all stood, you can talk over the cocktail hour. We all stood in the elevator going up to the gallery saying, what's going to happen on Monday, right? So, but that happened, but we're now getting to this next phase now, okay? And so my last key takeaways, I always like to leave people with takeaways, is that looking at artworks leads to positive impacts. It lowers stress, it improves mood. It also, importantly, increases the sense of social connectedness. Discussion-based viewing is enjoyable by many and enhances that social connectedness. Positive mood, how fast time goes by, much more so than sharing space. Actually, Sasha has a lot of data that suggests that nobody likes having people sit or stand next to you while you look at an artwork unless it's social, okay? And there are likely key individual differences, and you could see some of those. Some people do not like this, right? And some people have walloping differences. And I've just given you a really rough snapshot. There were many kinds of metrics that we got in the study. So there's much more to come. That's it from me.
This is time for questions.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, you might have covered this. In your first results slide, if I'm reading it correctly, it seemed as though people experiencing this in a lab felt much higher social connectedness than in a museum.
No, social connectedness was high across the board for the discussion groups in both the lab and in the museum. Yeah.
It's just the individual in the lab wasn't as high as.
Correct. The individual like like feeling more connected to the world, it turns out that was better in the museum context than it was for the lab. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Shay. I also have a neuroscience background. And actually, Dr. Chamberlain was my supervisor.
Well, great.
But I was just curious when it came to the neurosynchrony, if there are any patterns with like the regions of activation when it came to like the art viewing, if you notice anything like across the board or any specific patterns with that. I guess.
So the way that, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of that work, but the way that that work is emerging is that it doesn't take, it's not any single regions. It's actually like you get an index of full brain activity, where that most of that data starts to emerge. I think that there are just a lot of heterogeneity, and if you look at discrete areas of the brain. And so in fact, most of the people that are looking at neural alignment metrics are actually doing a whole brain analysis instead. Yeah. And there was, yeah.
Yeah, I also have a background in neuroscience, so I was just wondering, just like some of your compatriots over at the Barnes Foundation were sharing about a study in which they were measuring pleasure in intellectual, social, physical effects over a number of days. I was just wondering if you guys had any data about the duration or some of the effects you're looking at.
Yeah, so what these data come from are a pre-survey and then a survey after each looking experience. We also have a week later data and a month later data, but we haven't analyzed it yet. So we have, I imagine that there aren't going to be long-term effects. And the Barnes already has some data, preliminary data that suggests that maybe 2 days, right? But I think there are other metrics that we can probably get that are longer term that I'm actually really interested in. One of that is like memory, right? So what we know is that if you do a slow looking exercise, you're much more likely to be able to recall with much more precision about exactly what you saw. And I think that probably is persistent. I mean, my students who were with me in Paris tell me they can still tell me exactly all of the details of the painting they spent their hours with. So, yes.
And how you think this relates to the concept of incongruency? That really.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. We don't know, right? In this particular setting. I mean, the good news is that in the individuals in the lab, like people were actually sitting every other cubicle, right? And yet we still have these uplifting mood reports, even from the sort of on your own. So there isn't necessarily social contagion of mood. But I imagine that in the social dynamic groups, that's probably more present. It's hard to get rid of, right? It's hard to control and figure out whether that is the case. Yeah.
Is there a way to translate the concept of slow looking into other art forms?
Absolutely.
What does that look like?
I mean, so in my day job, I teach visual marketing, and so my students actually do the same kind of visual analysis. They spend a really long time. They don't actually know that I'm asking them to spend a really long time because I don't tell them you're going to spend a really long time. I just tell them during class for the next 90 minutes, you're going to look at one ad, and you're going to come up with what's going on there. So it's sort of surreptitious, but it's the same. It's actually the same kind of effect. But so I think any visual stimulus in that regard can work. I think that there is inherently something very nice about visual art because of the sort of natural ambiguity that's inherent in that. One of the reasons why I love the Barnes is there are no labels. Right. So people have to, and I actually encourage them to come in with a beginner's mindset. They don't need to know anything about it. And they can just and it can be abstract or it can be less abstract. All of that is equally just as effective.
Thank you, Zab.
Thank you.
We'll have to leave it.